One sentence on July 6 did what months of rallies, manifestos, and closed-door negotiations could not do. It shifted the center of gravity of South African politics in real time, live and unfiltered, forcing everyone, from cabinet ministers to ordinary citizens, to suddenly recalibrate what they thought they knew about power in 2025. At first it didn't sound explosive. It sounded measured, almost restrained. But that was the trap. Because as Mkhwanazi spoke, the country didn't immediately react with chaos. Instead, it went quiet. And in politics, silence is often louder than outrage. What followed in the hours and days after July 6 was not noise, but movement, quiet repositioning, urgent phone calls, hastily rewritten talking points, and alliances bending just enough to avoid snapping in public. What made that moment so dangerous to the status quo was not just what was said, but who said it and when. South Africa was already politically fatigued in 2025, worn down by economic pressure, governance debates, and a growing sense that the old playbook no longer worked. Into that atmosphere, Mkhwanazi didn't shout. He simply exposed a fault line that had been there all along. That alone changed everything. In the first days after July 6, analysts scrambled to frame the moment. Some called it reckless, others called it overdue, but very few immediately grasped its deeper implication. This wasn't a policy announcement or a party declaration. It was a reframing of authority. It subtly challenged the idea that political power in South Africa only flows downward from formal office. Instead, it reminded the nation that legitimacy can rise upward from credibility, timing, and public trust. Behind the scenes, the response was swift and uneasy. Senior figures who had been confident weeks earlier suddenly went off script. Scheduled speeches were delayed, statements were softened. What had been planned as a predictable second half of the year now felt unstable. July 6 became a reference point, a before and after moment that insiders used in private conversations long before the public fully caught on. Public reaction followed a different rhythm. On the surface, life continued. Markets opened, transport ran, parliament met. But in conversations at taxi ranks, workplaces, and online spaces, something shifted. People weren't arguing about party slogans anymore. They were questioning credibility. Who speaks truth when it costs them something? Who protects systems and who exposes them? Those questions lingered far longer than the original statement itself. The first major ripple was psychological. Political confidence, once shaken, does not collapse loudly. It erodes quietly. Leaders who had relied on predictability now faced uncertainty. Opponents didn't need to attack. They simply waited. In politics, when your rivals stop shouting, it's often because they're watching you bleed credibility on your own. Then came the strategic recalculations. Provincial power brokers, especially those accustomed to reading national signals early, began adjusting their tone. Support became conditional. Loyalty became cautious. The unspoken rule shifted from defend at all costs to observe before committing. July 6 had not removed anyone from office, but it had altered the rules of engagement. What shocked many observers was how quickly the narrative internationalized. Diplomatic circles took note, not because of drama, but because of stability concerns. When internal credibility debates surface so publicly, external partners listen carefully. South Africa's political story in 2025 suddenly felt less scripted and more volatile, even though nothing had technically fallen apart. Economically, the impact was subtle but real. Investors are less afraid of bad news than of uncertainty. July 6 injected questions without immediate answers, not panic questions, and questioned slow decisions. Projects paused, committees reviewed, risk assessments were quietly updated. None of this made front-page headlines, but all of it mattered. Inside political parties, the effect was even more pronounced. Internal factions interpreted the moment differently, using it to strengthen their own arguments. Some saw validation, others saw exposure. Meetings grew longer, consensus became harder. The idea that we can manage this internally began to weaken as public perception gained momentum. Civil servants, often the first to sense long-term shifts, reacted before voters did. Compliance tightened. Paper trails became cleaner. When systems sense scrutiny, they become cautious. July 6 didn't just challenge political leadership. It reminded institutions that accountability narratives can change overnight. As weeks passed, something unusual happened. The story refused to die. No new scandal was needed. No follow-up explosion occurred. Yet July 6 kept resurfacing in unrelated debates, cited as context, as warning, as proof that 2025 was not following old rules. That persistence signaled depth. Moments without depth fade quickly. This one didn't. Opposition parties benefited most from doing the least. By resisting the urge to overreact, they allowed the governing narrative to remain unsettled. Silence became strategy. Sometimes the smartest political move is to let uncertainty do the work for you. By the final quarter of the year, it became clear that planning for 2026 had already begun earlier than expected. Candidate positioning, messaging, and coalition calculations all carried the invisible imprint of July 6. People were no longer asking, "What will voters forget?" They were asking, "What will voters remember?" Historians tend to favor elections as defining moments, but not all turning points come with ballot boxes. Some come with a sentence delivered at precisely the wrong, or right, moment. July 6 may ultimately be remembered not as an act of defiance or disruption, but as a mirror held up to a system that preferred comfort over clarity. As 2025 closed, the political landscape looked familiar on the surface, yet fundamentally altered underneath. Offices remained occupied. Institutions stood, but the illusion of invulnerability had cracked. And once that happens, power never reassembles in quite the same way again. That is why July 6 continues to matter, not because it caused immediate collapse, but because it quietly rewrote assumptions. In politics, that kind of shift is the most dangerous of all.